Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you are joining us. I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker today, and her name is Larson. And welcome, Elle.
Hi, thank you, Phyllis.
Now, Elle is a sound practitioner and wellness designer who works with sound and space to help balance internal and external environments. She's been studying and practicing healing modalities for over 20 years and is certified in sound healing, Reiki, Ayurveda, feng shui, and 2 wellness building standards. Now, I know the title of your presentation today is Sound in Space. Can you explain a little bit about what that is and what that means to you?
Yeah, I've been working with sound for quite a while on different levels, and I've also been very interested in the spatial environment, so architecture and design. And even when I work with clients, with sound clients specifically, I'm working more to create space for them. So I'm creating a space, an external space for them where they can feel really supported, but also working to help to modify their internal space and help them through whatever process they're going through. So it's mostly creating this support through sound. And then that translated and into working with the actual spatial environment, starting to become interested in, well, how do spaces sound and how do the sound of spaces affect us? A lot of times things like noise mitigation is the only thing that's considered in how a space sounds and how can we make a space less noisy, but that doesn't necessarily facilitate like deeper balance or healing in us. So how can we really improve the sound of spaces? So that in a nutshell is basically how it can be applied to the individual and then also to built environments.
Well, I'm interested in your work in feng shui because I know that you're really deeply trying to understand and increase awareness of soundscape,
Mm.
both internal and external. And so I'm curious to share with our listeners today how that ties in with feng shui and how you're utilizing, how you're weaving the two of them together.
Yeah, so feng shui is all about energy flow, and all of this energy work that we're doing, whether you're doing Reiki or work with sound or something, or feng shui, it's dealing with energy flow. So that just kind of in the essence of with feng shui, it's definitely more spatial on a lot of levels because you're dealing with how are things arranged or the color or how you sense things. And typically we always tend, in especially in design, we tend to the visual aspects of design, but there's so many other sensory aspects to design, how you feel and also the way things sound. So in feng shui, there are a couple of what they call cures that are really typically used in terms of helping to balance a space. So it might be like a water feature or chimes or something. There's also like more subtle elements of, for example, planting trees that are going to attract birds and wildlife outside of a window. So you hear the sound of nature coming in, or thinking about what is the texture of this material that you're using, where where you can hear the sound when you sit on it or you walk on it, or the sound of a pathway. So those are really subtle elements, but also not so subtle when you think about it. And if it's used on a daily basis, that can be incorporated into design of spaces and feng shui specifically. So especially like your main route, your main path from one place to the next. What does that sound like? What does it sound like when you leave your home, leaving from your front door to your car, or walking from your front door to your kitchen or to your bedroom? Is it a sound that maybe grates on you a little bit and you don't even really notice it? And depending upon what shoes you wear, how does it feel when you take off those high heels or, your work shoes versus when you're in your socks? Like there's definitely a different tactile feeling, but also it's a different audible feeling that completely changes the sensation. Like there's an association of wearing these shoes that you wear to work all day and then taking them off and you're in your stocking feet. But there's also this whole soundscape that changes when you do that same action. So it's becoming aware of like those really subtle elements that do contribute to the full experience of it.
Yeah, I never thought about it in that context exactly. Um, because that's amazing to me because you think about it, I think you do get used to it.
Yeah,
And
for
it's
sure.
not really registering on a conscious level, but it doesn't mean that it's not causing a challenge or causing harm of some sort with that distortion that's happening.
And
So,
not even, and it's, sorry to interrupt, but not even just harm, but a slight alteration of your experience, right?
mhm.
Yeah. So it's yeah, and sound is one of those things where a lot of times we brush it off because we have to so frequently. We have to ignore things. There's construction going on next to me and behind me, and I have to ignore that sometimes. So what happens if we stop ignoring the things that we do have control over, and maybe just being a little bit more mindful of how we can shift those to a different state?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And that's kind of what I meant more. I think harm was
For
probably
sure. Yeah. Yeah.
um, not quite the right word, but maybe like it's kind of distorted. It's I know that sound for me, there can be a distortion of just my ability to be present in the moment
Yeah.
or to find that sense of peace within. And that's kind of more of the lines that I was speaking of because you're talking about just discovering the simple modifications that you can make within a space. And I wanted to ask so we can kind of circle around and weave that together. I was curious about your sound synthesis work and after that, kind of how it applies, how you've woven that into, or maybe it's the opposite direction, how you've woven feng shui components into that work and vice versa.
Ah, that's a great question. So for those of you who are listening and not familiar, I work with, in a lot of my group sessions, I work with what's called a modular synthesizer, which is essentially a deconstructed synthesizer where you're working with individual components to help to basically create sound from the ground level. So you start with an individual tone and you can work with the entire, almost the entire audible frequency spectrum of that tone. And then you you use patch cables, actual physical patch cables, to then modulate that tone and turn it into maybe a melody or something. And you can get really, really, excuse me, interesting textures and it feels like you're working with the shape of sound, which then for me brings it into a more visual visual sense of the sound and a more experiential sense of it. So I guess this also ties into my Ayurvedic background. And then with feng shui, also working with the elements. So Ayurveda and feng shui use slightly different elemental systems, but they're both very heavily based in the elements. So whenever I work with spaces and clients and even myself, I'm thinking of things in terms of the elements and the elemental balance. So when I work with sound, I think of sound in terms of the elements as well. So is this sound grounding? Is it earthy? Is it fiery? Is it like metal? Is it like air? And you can do that with everything from a drum to a bowl to woodwind instruments. And even the type of instrument doesn't even necessarily dictate the element that you can express with it, right? There's so many different ways that you can play a drum or a flute or something. Like you, if you increase the pace or you use a different mallet, you're going to get a different tone out of it. So especially with the synthesizer, with sound synthesis, I have a full spectrum of sounds and different types of modulation that I can do with those sounds at my fingertips. So for me, that's a really nice way to kind of weave in the elements. And then obviously, like a very practical application of that is designing a soundscape for somebody for their space. And typically it would be, maybe a 2 to 3 hour long soundscape. That's just very, very minimal. I tend to work very, very minimal, very slow, kind of modulation of the sound. So it's not something that you like. Maybe you listen to it, maybe you don't. It kind of weaves in and out of your awareness. But that's how I would more in a practical application intertwine the synthesis and the feng shui. But the elements is the root of everything that I work with.
Oh, that's amazing. So when you're talking about creating the soundscapes for maybe individual clients for their homes or businesses and so forth, and with the synthesis work, how have you found that this is affecting people or really transforming them when they're actually listening to these soundscapes? Have you heard, what are the outcomes of that?
Definitely balance, relaxation. If you're using it as a meditation or something, if you're taking 15 to 20 minutes out and using it as a meditation, um, primarily stress relief and grounding and balance. That's a lot of the space that I like to work in, because most people need grounding and release, and stress relief. And that's sometimes people need things that are more activating, but we typically get that enough during our day. So I generally like to work in more of the grounding and the balance aspect of things.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you work with sound with your individual clients?
As far as a practitioner, so I see a lot of private sound clients. So yeah, I guess it varies because I have a private I have a private sound practice where I use Himalayan bowls and acoustic instruments around them. And for that, again, it's about creating the space for them. So it's about having them feel safe in the room where I'm working with them, and then creating a sonic space around them, and then also within them, and modifying that as I kind of sense that they're shifting through different things. So that would be with individual sound clients where it's more of a sonic treatment. In the aspect of feng shui or with spatial design, um, again, it can range everything from working with noise mitigation, which that's more of an acoustician job, and I'm definitely not an acoustician. The acoustics is an entire science in itself, so I leave that to the professionals. But it would be more so in thinking like, what is the primary purpose, and what are some of the imbalances that are experienced in this space? So if the primary purpose of the space is for focus, you want it to have a different sonic environment than if the primary purpose is creativity. So focus is definitely going to be a lot of noise mitigation and reducing some of these external distractions. And something for creativity, you will want something more activating and bright. And maybe there's going to be, they're probably going to choose different types of music than than the people who want focus, or than a meeting room will call for. So it really depends upon what is the purpose of the space. A bedroom is different than a living room, and even different office spaces are much different from each other. So it really has to be individual in that sense of what are people needing. And then that ties back into Ayurveda again as well, or elemental balance. If you can look at what is the nature of the space, what is the primary purpose of the space, and what are some existing and potential imbalances that can occur. So if we're looking in a workspace, and it's an existing team that's together, and they know what are some of the existing imbalances that they experience, and then you can kind of sense what are some of the potential imbalances that could also occur. So then you can also think about the layer of time on top of that. How do you feel at 10 a.m. versus how do you feel at 4 p.m.? What is the lighting like at 10 a.m. versus 4 p.m.? What could the sound be like at 10 a.m. versus 4 p.m.? Are we working with a soundscape? Are we working with playlists? Are we just dealing with, the traffic noises at these different times of day? So there's a lot of elements that go into thinking about like the sound design, the architectural sound design of a space like that.
Well, there's so many elements to consider that most people don't even think about. So now that then is falling into the category of wellness design.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
How do you if when a client comes to you, and I'm curious, how do you approach wellness design for their specific things? Do you approach the space? Are there different questions that you need answered? How do you actually approach wellness design from that standpoint?
Well, it's interesting because people either come to you for something like that specifically because they know about it. Um, when you get into more of the like architecture and commercial um, building world, it's becoming more known, especially after this experience that we've just had the last, or we're continuing to have this, the last year and a half. People are much more aware of the wellness of their spaces and the health of their environment. So a feng shui client is going to come to me because they know about feng shui and they feel that their space is imbalanced, or they're having this health imbalance or something, or they've heard about it, and they know that this can be improved in this way. So that's, they understand the connection between wellness and their built space around them. If it's a larger client in a larger space, office building or something like that, maybe they've heard of WELL, maybe they've heard of FitWell, which are these two building standards that assess essentially the health of spaces on many different levels, including the sonic environment. And then that's the inroad with it, because it's a building standard that's accepted around the industry. And maybe it might just be that some things are snuck in as far as experiential aspects of it, where instead of it just being a very standard building, you insert some things like some really beneficial views. You notice that there's a beautiful landscape around, and you make use of that. Or, okay, there's a busy street, so you might want to position things slightly different. And the architecture firm that I work for is very forward thinking, and also has a lot of experience in working with Buddhist communities and Native American communities, and working on the more meditative side of building and design.
That's really exciting that architecture firms actually have someone like you in consultation for this now. And thinking
Mm,
about that, I think that's really fantastic.
thank you.
Do you have something that you would like to, an experiential experience that you could share with us today, to kind of, so the listeners can kind of get a feel of what it is that you're talking about specifically regarding the inner or external soundscape?
Yeah. I think it would be nice to do a short soundscape meditation. First of all, what is soundscape? So soundscape is basically all of the sounds that are around us at any given point in time. So soundscape could be the construction going on behind you, in conjunction with the birds that are chirping, in conjunction with your air conditioner that is running, and then all of a sudden your dogs bark and it's the sound of your breath. So that's the definition of soundscape, is all of the sounds around you. So let's do just a short meditation, and it also includes the sounds within you. So we'll do a short meditation with you experimenting and listening to your soundscape. And this is something that's good to practice in different spaces, and also at several different times of the day, because the soundscape in the morning at 8 o'clock might be different than even 9 a.m. Or significantly different from the evening. So let's just take a few moments, and you can settle in. You can close your eyes if you'd like. Just take a deep breath, deep inhale through your nose, and exhale through your mouth. And doing that a few more times. Deep inhale through your nose, inhalation, collecting anything you don't need. And exhale, releasing it. And one more, inhaling. And exhaling. Just letting your breath settle into your body. allowing your body to settle into your seat. And then shifting your awareness to your heartbeat. So feeling your heartbeat and understanding that sound is also vibration. Sensing any other energy flows internally. And listening to the sound of your breath. Thinking of your breath as your internal world and your external world merging. And then expanding your listening to the space of your room. Are there any subtle sounds you've never noticed before? And then expanding your listening to just outside your room, listening for sounds that are close by. And then expanding further and listening for sounds that are more subtle, that are further away. And then opening up and listening to all of these sounds together, or experiencing all these sounds together, from your heartbeat to your breath, to the sounds of your room, to the obvious and subtle sounds outside. listening to them with neutrality. And then coming back to the sounds inside your room. Coming back to the sound of your breath. And settling back into your heartbeat. And taking a deep breath, really feeling your feet expanding through your crown. And exhaling. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And that's your soundscape.
That was absolutely beautiful. And it always amazes me just how deeply centered you become when you begin to put your attention into these different spaces.
Mm.
And that's what you've shared is actually something that our listeners could do every single day.
Yes, please.
What actually came to mind during that for me was you've so eloquently explained what it is that you do. And so I am curious how this all came into being for you. How did you, what is the why behind what you do? How did you actually enter into this field and expand the work into where you are today?
I mean, my dad would say my life is a blender, but it's been a very organic and, seemingly at many times random, that's now come into a culmination of where I'm at and what I'm doing. I'm very much the sort of person who wakes up one day and thinks, I have to do this. And that might seem impulsive, but then in retrospect, there's this trail that's led me there. I worked at clubs. I worked at nightclubs in my 20s, in the office, but spending a lot of time in nightclubs. I DJ'd, so I was always listening to the sound of spaces. I was always critiquing sound systems. I was finding the best spot that didn't hurt my ears, but had that sweet spot still. And then I started practicing yoga in my early 20s, and my love of music and sound came together, or my love of music and wellness came together into working with sound healing and studying that. And then I wanted to expand that. I wanted to expand all my wellness practices into the built environment. And I already had a strong affinity with design and architecture, and it was something that I really enjoyed. And I thought there must be some consideration of sound in architecture. And then I think it was 2014 or 2015, there was a piece in the New York Times that was, hey, architects, why sound matters, or something to that effect. And I was like, see, somebody else is thinking the same thing as well. So it took a couple years for me to then make the jump, developing my sound practices and some other things. And then a few years ago, I started working at an architecture firm, and then realized that there was these building wellness certificates that had started up, and sound is a very small portion of them, but it was an opportunity for me to, get in on that side of things. But essentially, it was wanting to work with sound in the built environment. That's very, very niche. Um, it's Again, it's one of those things that there's got to be the right client and the right budget, essentially, to really have sound be a main focus of a space. But there's so many other wellness opportunities to work with spaces in, from the toxicity of the materials to air filtration to lighting and things. So that's kind of how everything merged together.
Beautiful. Well, through all of that, what I'm curious about, I'm not sure how to ask this question, because I'm thinking, there's many people that go in and do clearings or space
Mm.
clearings,
Yep.
which take place within a moment in time. It's a couple hours and so forth. And I'm curious what the differentiation is. I mean, obviously, feng shui is going to be long term because you're setting up a space for a long term. What are some of the active components of that? I mean, are there similarities, or are there really not similarities?
100%. There's 100% similarities. And I do a lot of space clearings when I do feng shui consultation. So oftentimes, and I studied the BTB tradition, and my teacher, we were taught how to do space clearings in our feng shui course. And I had done them previously through my sound practice before, but that is 100% a component of doing a feng shui consultation, or it can be. Like, it doesn't have to be, but I think it's very important to clear space. The other aspect of it is working with space, like on a shamanic level, because frequently a building was, constructed on a piece of land without really consulting or working with the land, or preparing the land, or preparing the trees that are going to be cut down for the land. So there's this, not to be dramatic, but there's a level of trauma on the land that has not necessarily been resolved, that can be worked with. So space clearings can be long-term. They can last for quite a while. Especially if you're resolving some of these longer term issues that could potentially still be problematic for, even if it's not necessarily noticeable for the residents on some level, it hasn't been mitigated with the land. So, doing some journeying work, or doing space clearings, things like that, working with geopathic stress. Those are all can be part of the feng shui practice.
Okay, beautiful. So when you are actually doing space clearing, I know there's a number of different components. If you wouldn't mind sharing a kind of a simple thing about kind of what it is, how you approach that, what it is that you do to clear a space, and also if you're bringing sound into that. I know some people use, a singing bowl, or they ring a bell, or they might play, I utilize a drum when I do space clearing. So in the utilization of the instruments, the sound component of it, I'm curious what your approach is, and then if you then have any techniques to share with the listeners about how they themselves could activate, do some activation or clearing within their own spaces. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, for sure. So I think of sound clearing and working with sound in a space, similar as I work with my clients who are on the table with bowls, surrounded by bowls, is you want to clear and release things before you activate them. So making sure that there's excess stress or trauma, or things that have been released from a space or a person before you begin to activate things. And this is something that it makes sense, but it was very much instilled, by my teacher, Dion Mandel, my bowls teacher. You never want to activate something or a person who is still under stress. because that can be activating the wrong things. Like even if you're like, oh, this part of them, could use some activation. Wait until they're grounded and in a very balanced space. So same thing goes for space. Like if you go into a person's home, and the first step is decluttering and cleaning. It's always very helpful if the person has cleaned their home first and gone through some sort of decluttering process. So you're not kind of amplifying a lot of this old energy that they still have around them. If you have a lot of things, that's fine. If you're using them, they're meaningful for you. They're not just sitting there collecting dust. That's great. But definitely make sure to go through your physical space and maybe get rid of some things that you don't necessarily need, or maybe things that have negative connotations for you. So that would be my first recommendation, is doing a physical clearing of your space before you start to bring in sound. I think bowls are great for helping to balance a space and release energy, especially if you're singing them and striking them. Drums are great as well for helping to shake up some things that are loose. So opening up all your cabinets, opening up your windows, using things like salt, essential oils, some lighter incense as you go through to help clear it. So first going through and thinking about clearing out old energy, releasing old energy as you're going through your room or your house or whatever the space is. It could even just be your kitchen cabinets. It doesn't really matter. But that would be the first step, is to think about releasing. And you want to have an intention. So this is an intentional activity. You're not just letting all the sound do the work, but you want to get your energy into it as well. So you can maybe feel some of these things being released. And it might even be like, you might feel inspired to blow on a space or help to blow and shift some of that energy out, or put some fans up or something. So going around and really paying attention to, the dark corners of spaces, behind doors, opening up drawers as you go through with an instrument that to you symbolizes and represents this releasing aspect. And then you would go around, then, wash your hands, clear yourself, come in with your other intention of what do you want to activate in your space? What are some intentions that you want to start to bring in now that you've created some physical space by getting rid of some things, maybe, or cleaning, and then you've cleared some energy out with sound? And what do you want to activate? What do you want to invite into your space now that there's a little bit more room for it? And then probably something brighter tonality, like bowls or bells or chimes, tuning forks. A lot of times I'll use tuning forks for this part of it. And going around basically the same process with something that sounds more activating. If you only have one instrument, let's say you have one bowl, and if you do have a couple of mallets for that bowl, you can play the bowl in different ways. So maybe, again, if you have one bowl, you're going around and doing this releasing, you're singing the bowl, or you're striking it at a slightly slower tone. And then activating, you can use the same bowl. Maybe you're striking it a little bit faster, and your intention is putting into activating the space. But again, make them two separate practices of this releasing, reset yourself, wash your hands, and then going around to activate. And that's how I approach things.
Yeah, I think one of the key things of all of this is really the intention that one is holding.
Yeah.
Most definitely, which you mentioned. So, do you have anything that you wish to share in regards to any upcoming workshops, events, or new programs that you have created to our listeners?
I have a workshop the 4th through the 8th of August, so that's probably already passed. Otherwise, I've been doing a lot of studying. And with the pandemic, I've held off on scheduling very much, but I'm finishing up another course, and I've been in a very hermit mode of things the last year. So I'm starting to think about coming out of that space. So apart from this workshop that I have, I don't have anything planned,
Okay,
but maybe soon.
they can find you on your website as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, given what we've talked about today, which I find really exciting, is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with today that could help them kind of on their next step, or something that that they could utilize to make some changes within their lives?
Yeah. So, you know, paying attention to your soundscape and what really nourishes you. Does it nourish you to, if you have if you notice that there's birds singing outside in the morning, and you have 5 minutes to either stand by the window or sit outside and drink your coffee or your tea and appreciate those birds, does that support you more than maybe listening to the news in the morning? Um, I realize that, and it really does for me. And then also, maybe you have to take some aspects of your soundscape with some neutrality. And it might be construction that you're hearing, and that's how it is. And you've got to come to this space of acceptance because it's going to be temporary. You might hear it for a while. But when there are things that you can change about what you're hearing and what you're doing, maybe try to change those things. So again, whether it's taking off your shoes or putting a rug down on a floor that's very noisy, see what you can modify in your space.
Beautiful. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you today, Elle, and thank you so much for your time and your expertise and just sharing with our listeners today. And to our listeners, thank you all for tuning in and being part of this beautiful session.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, everyone.